All right, so tonight I plan on trying to finish up with the book of Judges and dealing with Samuel. So when we talk about Samuel, we've drawn a number of lessons from his life overall, from things that we could see in his character, some of the things that he taught on consistently, that sort of thing. Well, tonight we're going to take a look sort of at the end of the story. And we might not get as many lessons out of it tonight, but I want us to try to understand the conclusion of everything. So remember that Samuel was a Levite, and he was a prophet, and he was the last judge of Israel. So he was the one tasked by God and by the people of Israel, because the people demanded it, and God said, go ahead and do it, with choosing and anointing a king for the nation. Now, actually, God is the one who chose the king, but that's why a prophet of God was the one given that task. I do want to just point out that when the people reject a king, we see later on, when they set up their own kings, they don't ask the current king to pick and anoint the next king when they're rejecting a king. And they really were not rejecting Samuel when they asked for a king. They were honoring him and asking him to do what his position enabled him to do. They really did show respect. Now, they did not listen to the warnings he gave them, and he indicates that they sinned in asking for a king, especially because of the reasons why. But they did at least respect Samuel and give him that task. And of course, God also gave him that task to anoint the king. And of course, the first king was Saul. And I want to talk a little bit about Samuel's relationship with Saul. We've talked a little bit about it already, but when we read about Saul, we find that he seems to be a pretty humble man. In 1 Samuel 9 and verses 20 through 21, when Samuel talks to him when they first meet, and God has told him some things about Saul, that he will be the next king. He tells him about his donkeys, that they've been found, and then he says, "And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and on all your father's house?" And in verse 21, Saul answered and said, "Am I not a Benjamite, of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak like this to me?" Now, if you remember from previous lessons, the tribe of Benjamin is the one that defended the wicked city and almost was completely wiped out. And that's why it was the smallest tribe in Israel. They had been regrowing from 600 men, and now they had already reached quite a lot more than that, but they're still the smallest tribe in Israel. But he also says that his family is the least of all the families, and I'm not sure that that was accurate. I think it's a statement of humility. If you go back up to the beginning of the chapter, it says in verses 1 and 2, "There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becheroth, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people." So Saul is the tallest man in the whole country, right? Among all the Israelites, he is the tallest man. He's the most handsome man in the country. And his father is a mighty man of power. So he's not just some average person. He is someone who stands out, but he seems to, in his wording, demonstrate some level of humility. And even when it comes to the time to anoint him, and they're casting lots so that it's clear that the Lord is choosing this person, they can't find Saul when he's been chosen. And in verse 22, they inquired further of the Lord, Has the man come here yet? And the Lord answered, There he is, hidden among the equipment. So they ran and brought him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. So he's even hiding. He's not there feeling like he should be made king. He's not a proud person, it doesn't seem like. And he even has some wisdom, it seems. So now Samuel points out that, do you see who the Lord has chosen, that there's no one like him among all the people? Of course, that's based on his physical appearance, isn't it? They don't know anything about his character. But he looks like a king. He looks physically like he should be the leader of the people. And so Samuel explains the behavior of royalty, writes it down, all of that. And Saul goes home and valiant men go with him. But in verse 27, it says, But some rebels said, How can this man save us? So they despised him and brought him no presents, but he held his peace. So he did not lash out at these rebellious people. He took it and just accepted it here at the beginning. And so we see this kind of humility that he has. But he also has wisdom and leadership. In chapter 11, we find that there's a city that's under attack. And when he finds out, he takes a yoke of oxen, in verse 7, cut them into pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen. And so everybody comes, and there's 300,000 from Israel and 30,000 from Judah. And they defeat this enemy army very clearly. But I do want to point out that he puts himself together with Samuel. They are the two leaders side by side. He's the king, but Samuel's still the judge and a prophet of God. And so they're working together here. So they're ruling in a sense, or leading the people side by side. When we get down to verse 12 through 15, after their great victory, everybody's happy. They see the wisdom of Saul, that he's a great leader. And it says that the people said to Samuel, Who is he who said, Shall Saul reign over us? Bring them in, that we may put them to death. But Saul said, Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel. Then Samuel said to the people, Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. And so they make Saul king all over again, this time not just based on him being chosen by God and being the tallest person around, but because now they see, oh, yes, we can unite behind him. He's a good leader. We can follow this man. With that understanding, let's recommit ourselves to this kingdom. And you see that he didn't, Saul had the opportunity to punish these people who were rebelling against him and insulting him, but he did not do that, which was the right thing to do. He had the right attitude. But this did not last long. And I want to say that I don't know if it's his humility that went away or if humility just simply isn't enough. You really have to have a heart dedicated to seeking God. And I'm not sure that Saul ever really had that. We don't see a lot of evidence of that. Yes, he talks about the Lord. The Lord gave them victory. But later on, he'll talk about the Lord delivering David into his hand when he's rebelling against the Lord. So I don't really know how much his heart is really dedicated towards God, even if he's humble in general. In 1 Samuel 13, in verses 1 and 2, it says that Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, and so on. And this is the time when he offers the sacrifice, and God is going to tell him that he's not going to keep the kingdom in his family. But even here, I just want to point out as kind of a side point, but Jonathan, his son, is a leader, a military leader, after he's only reigned for 2 years. Saul is not as young as I usually think he was when he was anointed king. He has a grown son. He's already a mature man when he becomes king. Then in verses 13 through 14, that's where Samuel tells Saul, "You've done foolishly regarding offering the sacrifice and not waiting for Samuel to come and do it, as he was commanded to do." And so in verse 14, he tells him that the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. And that's what we see is not true about Saul. Even though this is only 2 years after he became king, he's not a man after God's heart. And when we get to chapter 15, when we find that he did not follow through with the command to destroy the Amalekites, the word of the Lord came to Samuel saying, "I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments." And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So God says, "I regret that I set up Saul as king." I don't believe this means that God didn't know this was going to happen when he made Saul king. The prophecies go way back that the kings are going to come from the line of Judah, not Benjamin. And so he knew that it was not going to be Saul's family that's going to be in power forever. But even if God knows something is going to happen, and he has a good reason for letting this thing happen, he still regrets that it happens. God hates sin. He hates the consequences of sin. It's like when he says, "I regret that I made man," when he sent the flood. It's not that God didn't know that man was going to become wicked, but he still regrets that that happened because it's awful. And he's not causing it to happen. He's not causing anyone to sin. He hates sin. And this demonstrates that he hates it, even if he knows it's going to happen. But with Samuel, it really grieved him. He loved God. He loved Saul. And when they're not together, it grieves Samuel. You know, when you have friends that don't get along with each other, it's upsetting. And especially when God is one of them, right? That's really bad. And it became so bad that in verse 35, Samuel went no more to see Saul until the day of his death. And Saul even became hostile or an enemy towards Samuel. When God sends Samuel to anoint a new king, he tells him in verse 2, Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." That's the attitude that Saul has towards Samuel at this point. But God tells him, Saul doesn't need to know about it. Just tell them you've come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. And that's not a lie. He says, then invite Jesse to the sacrifice. He is making a sacrifice to the Lord. He doesn't have to tell them what else he's doing there. All right, so that gives us a picture of how the relationship with Saul went. But what about with David? What about Samuel's relationship with David? Well, when he goes to anoint this new king, David's brothers are the first ones to come. And so in verse 6, so it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And I want you to notice the contrast between this and the choosing of Saul. With the choosing of Saul, it was almost all about his physical stature, wasn't it? That was the thing pointed out to people. That's what Samuel found very impressive. He's the tallest man in Israel, very handsome. Nobody can be like him to be the leader. But God says, no, that does not tell you anything about what's going to make a good leader. It's what's in the heart. That is what is going to make a good leader. And God is the one who knows what is in the heart. And even with David, when he comes, it says he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. It's not that he was ugly, but he's not described as the most handsome man in Israel or the tallest or anything like that. He is simply a reasonably good looking, attractive person, and healthy, right? And a worker. He's ruddy, which generally tells you he's spent a lot of time out in the sun. He's red. That's what ruddy means. He's turned red, and so he's a hard worker. So he anoints him with oil, and later on in chapter 16 and verse 18, it tells us that when Saul needs someone to come play the harp for him, this is how they describe David. He's skillful in playing the harp. He's a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person. So all of those things are there with him. He's not an unskilled person. He's not somebody who can't handle himself in battle or anything like that. He's not someone who can't speak properly. He's a good-looking person. But the final thing is really important. The Lord is with him. That's the important thing. They could tell the Lord was with him, and the Lord was with him because he was with God. That's something Saul did not have. And so when Saul tries to kill David later on in chapter 19, David fled and escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. So here he goes to Samuel. He doesn't know where else to go. But that's a great place to go because Samuel is another leader in Israel, the one who's anointed him king, as well as the one who anointed Saul king. And he's a prophet of God, so he's a great one to go to. And Samuel, even though he's an old man here, I don't know how old, but he leaves home with David to go stay in another place to be safe from Saul. He doesn't say, David, get out of here, you're endangering me. He goes with him. And that will end up, I think, helping to protect David because Saul sends these messengers, and when they come, they all start prophesying, and they don't even come back to Saul, it doesn't seem like. And so Saul finally goes himself, and the Spirit of God came upon him too. And in verse 24, it says, and he also stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all that day and all that night. Therefore, they say, is Saul also among the prophets? You know, he was not a righteous man. He was going to try to kill David, but God used him prophesying and really being overcome by the Spirit in a way that we don't see very often in the Bible to protect David. But that's because David was there with Samuel the prophet, right? And then we have Samuel's final prophecy. I realize I'm going a little over time, but I just want to try to finish this. So in Samuel's final prophecy, it's actually going to happen after he dies. In 1 Samuel 25, it tells us, then Samuel died, the Israelites gathered together, lamented for him, buried him. He was well respected all the way to his death. The Israel really loved Samuel. But when we get to chapter 28, when there's the big battle between Israel and the Philistines, Saul is afraid. He wants an answer from God. God won't talk to him. And Samuel's dead, so he can't ask Samuel. Unless he can find someone who can talk to the dead. But it says Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Well, so now he wants to find someone who can talk to the dead so that he can talk to Samuel. Because he's the one that he trusts to actually be able to give him an answer, even after Samuel is dead. And so they find someone, a woman who is a medium, and she asks him in verse 11, who shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and so on. And now there are people who will tell you, these people are frauds, and I agree with that. I believe these people are all frauds. I don't think there's anybody who can talk to the dead. But I don't believe that this is a case where she's being a fraud. I believe this is a case of God actually bringing Samuel up. There are some who will say, no, she was just pretending. Samuel wasn't there. She just told Saul what anybody could have known based on what has gone on. But that's not how it's worded at all. It says she saw Samuel. It says in verse 15, now Samuel said to Saul. In verse 16, then Samuel said, and it talks about the words of Samuel in verse 20. This is not somebody pretending to talk to the dead. This was actually Samuel talking from the dead, prophesying that the Lord has taken away the kingdom from Saul, that Saul is going to die, he and his sons, the next day, which of course happened. And this does not mean that it was okay. In fact, it's clearly condemned that he went to talk to this medium, to talk to the dead. But still, God used Samuel to give a prophecy even after Samuel was dead, which is very unique. So Samuel loved Saul, but Saul rejected God, and by rejecting God, Saul became an enemy of Samuel. And that's what happens in our lives. If we love people, but they reject God, they generally become our enemy, because we have to cling to God and be faithful to him and say what God says no matter what. Samuel helped David, but it's not because David was Saul's enemy, but because God chose David, and David was doing what was right. And when he was anointing the next king, if God hadn't been there instructing him, Samuel would have made the same mistake that God was demonstrating through Saul. I think one of the reasons God chose Saul is to demonstrate that physical impressiveness does not demonstrate good leadership. That's a mistake to think that physical impressiveness shows that someone will be a good leader. And Samuel is the only prophet, as far as I know, who gave a prophecy after his death, unless it's maybe Elijah in 2 Chronicles 21:12, where there's a letter from him that comes to a king that I think was after his time. And then, of course, we know Jesus was raised from the dead, and he gave prophecies after that. But main takeaways, if you have a leader who's physically impressive, that's not worth much. But if you have a leader who has a heart that seeks God, it's worth a lot. But even Samuel couldn't see what God could see. You can be as spiritually minded as you want to be. You don't know what's right unless God says so. We've got to listen to God. All right, sorry for going over time, but that's the lesson for tonight. Thank you.